Good afternoon. I'm Suzanne Borden, Moment Magazine's Zoominar producer, and I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Women Speak Out, Confronting War, Rape, and the Rise in Hate, an interfaith conversation with Zainab Khan, Shirin Taber, Heidi Basch-Harod, and Nadine Epstein. Today's Moment Live Zoominar is in partnership with the WNET Group's reporting initiative, Exploring Hate, Antisemitism, Racism, and Extremism. Exploring Hate investigates the roots and rise of hate here and around the world, and their content appears on all of WNET's local and national broadcasts and across their digital platforms. The WNET Group is home to 13, America's flagship PBS television station in New York City. Moment Magazine sponsors the Anti-Semitism Project, which includes in-depth articles that take a deep dive into anti-Semitic incidents, monthly Moment Live conversations on different facets of anti-Semitism, as well as the Anti-Semitism Monitor, which tracks and contextualizes anti-Semitic incidents around the world. Now it is my pleasure to introduce today's guests. Zainab Khan was born in Chicago to immigrant parents from Pakistan and Afghanistan. She is the co-founder and chair of the Muslim American Leadership Alliance and has served as a United Nations delegate on the Commission on the Status of Women since 2013. An acclaimed visual artist, Zainab was honored with the inaugural UNICEF Next Generation Chicago Humanitarian Award. Zainab recently published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal on the need for Muslim Americans to combat anti-Semitism after the terrorist attack in Israel on October 7th. Shirin Taber is the daughter of an Iranian Muslim father and an American Christian mother. She is the founder and executive director of Empower Women Media and is the author of Muslims Next Door. Shirin has partnered with the George Bush Institute Women's Leadership Initiative and in the United Nations Office for Genocide Prevention to produce media projects focused on women's rights and countering religious-based violence. Most recently, she began the Abraham Women's Alliance. Heidi Basch-Harod is a Jewish American and Israeli citizen and is a scholar of modern history of the Middle East and North Africa, specializing in women's rights movements of the region. Heidi is the executive director of Women's Voices Now, a Los Angeles-based nonprofit that uses film to drive positive social change to advocate girls' and women's rights globally. Heidi is also a Holocaust educator and teaches about anti-Semitism, other forms of racism and bigotry, and the power of film to make social change. Heidi recently published an op-ed in Newsweek on women's rights in a post-October 7th world. Also joining us today is Nadine Epstein, editor-in-chief and CEO of Moment Magazine and founder and executive director of the Center for Creative Change. Please welcome Zainab Khan, Shirin Taber, Heidi Basch-Harod, and Nadine Epstein.
Thank you, Suzanne. Each of these amazing women here today have dedicated their life's work to strengthening communities and building bridges between other communities. They are leaders from different faiths, Muslim, Christian, and Jewish, and very different backgrounds. And they support each other's work, and they're able to talk with one another about difficult issues. Then came October 7th and the horrific attacks on Israel, which have made their work so much harder. And by the way, they met through their human rights and their coalition building work, and they're all now participating in the Abraham Women's Alliance, which we're going to hear a little bit about, which was founded by Shirin after October 7th. But what's so special is that despite the climate of hate that we're living in, these remarkable women are persisting. They're speaking out against hate and anti-Semitism, and they're continuing to build bridges at what is a really difficult time. And we're so honored to have them here, have the three of you here with us today. Thank you. Briefly, I was wondering, and I know we could talk for so long, but I just wanted to learn a little bit about each of you. I know that, just tell us a little bit about your background, where you grew up and how that influences what you do today. And just for a minute, because there's so much we have to talk about. Why don't we start? Shirin, we'll start with you.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. And I love this team of women, brave lioness women standing in the gap, including you, Nadine. And so thank you so much for allowing us to share today. I come from a mixed heritage, and I have an Iranian Muslim father and an Irish Catholic mother, and they met in the US when my dad came over as an international student, and he married a California blonde, and our family is very diverse. We have two different religions, cultures, languages, food, and we love it all. And I wrote an article several years ago. The New York Times had a women's platform at the time. It was called Women of the World. And the editor said, Shireen, tell me more about your dad. How is it that, you were able to become the person you are? And I realized the greatest gift he gave me was religious freedom, and that he allowed me to ultimately make my own faith decision, which is a little different than his and a little different than my mom. But I do seek to honor both traditions and faiths. And ultimately, I love being a bridge builder. I had to learn those skills as a child, living in a home with two different faiths and cultures. And now as a network, we're really passionate about multi-faith work and bringing people together.
Great. Zainab, tell us just a little bit about you.
Yes, thank you, Nadine, once again for including our voices. So my background, I was born in Chicago, Illinois. My mother was Indo-Pakistani. My father was from Afghanistan. And I grew up, celebrating 4th of July as the biggest holiday. My father fled Afghanistan in 1957, came here. I'm really proud of my Muslim American heritage, my identity. I started Mala as a platform because there wasn't an organization that represented so many Muslim Americans such as myself that have, we're not tied down in any political or theological, representation, rather our own American journeys and our human stories. And so my sisters themselves, I have a very multi-faith background. I'm married to an Iranian secular, man. And my son has Persian heritage. And so kind of trying to find a place of what represents us has always been something that I've always struggled with, and found an opportunity to create an organization where, different heritage, different multi-generational nuances can be celebrated with pride. And so hence in this space after October 7th, what I saw was just, a really big need to amplify voices that are within our community, but not organized because we just don't have that representation. So, coming into this as a woman, as a mom, as a Muslim, as an American, I just definitely see a huge need for, shifting the narrative and the paradigm of what's out there.
We're going to get to that in a minute. So I promise. And Heidi, just tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to your work.
Thank you, Nadine. And so wonderful to be here with all of you women. So I also come from an interfaith background. On my mom's side, I have Sicilian Catholics, and on my dad's side, Jewish from the foothills of the Carpathian Mountains. So I grew up having the abundance of so much beauty of tradition and faiths, and making it work, right? Everyone being able to be together as much as possible. When I was 10 years old, my grandfather, who was a Holocaust survivor, spoke to my 6th grade English class, reading class. And I remember I went home that night and went to bed and couldn't sleep and thought, I must work to make the world a better place. And his parting message to students was always, we must be our brothers and sisters keepers. And I really took that to heart. And through my synagogue youth group, I was always very active in the Tikkun Olam, the healing the world part of things, social action. In leadership roles, I got to do so many activities through my synagogue. And then I always gravitated towards women's rights issues. Also, though, when I studied at UC Berkeley with religious studies, peace and conflict studies, political science, it was during the time of the Second Intifada, and I was determined, growing up in a strongly Zionistic home and very supportive of Israel and cognizant of the need for the Jewish people to have a homeland and to be in their homeland. After graduating from UC Berkeley, eventually I knew I needed to go to the land to study the conflict for myself without other people telling me how to think about it. So I moved to Israel at 25. I worked for the Israel-Palestine Journal, dove deep into the issues, and then ended up at Tel Aviv University for Middle Eastern history, where, because I understood the importance of knowing history, to do anything useful in terms of conflict resolution in that region of the world. And I went further into women's rights movements of the Middle East, because women in the Middle East, against all odds, have been fighting for centuries for so many noble things. And then when I moved back to Los Angeles in 2012, I met the founder of Women's Voices Now. And at the time, the organization specifically focused on women's voices from the Muslim world, and it was like the dream job. And for the past 11 years, I've been meeting women and filmmakers from all over the world who believe that amplifying their voices is the way for change and a more peaceful and just world for us all.
Great, thank you. Well, you've all been doing amazing work, and we're going to hear a little bit more about that. But October 7th happened, and and I know that from speaking to you earlier that you all feel like you've been living in an alternative reality and that your work has been hijacked. And I'm wondering, if you could tell us, each of us, again, I'm going to just maybe ask you some questions, but, how that's impacted you. And Shireen, we talked a little bit about the Abraham Women's Alliance. Mm-hmm. And I know that this is something you started. This is actually not, your main work has been focused on women in the media. But tell us about why after October 7th, like what happened, how you felt when October 7th happened, and why you decided to start this group.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, it's a humbling journey. I'll keep it brief, but historically, we've worked mostly with Muslim and Christian women because the violations were the greatest towards them in the Middle East. And we found oftentimes Jewish women were, doing better, more educated, had economic empowerment. And so we'd invite them to join our media fellowship, our film festivals. But we didn't, it didn't feel like there was a real felt need. And then October 7th happened. And we were all just blown away. I mean, just couldn't believe the anti-Semitism, the college protests, the whole package. And I'd never seen that in my lifetime. And my grandfather on my mother's side, Irish, Thomas Patrick Logan, actually fought in World War II, came home, but died shortly after from so many, health issues and so forth related to the war. So, I'm old enough to know about the Holocaust, and thankfully was raised taking this issue really seriously. And now it was like on the world stage. So there was just something that came up inside of me, like, we have to respond. So we started reaching out to some of the Jewish colleagues that we know. We're like, how can we help? And we found there was a real interest to actually work more together. So we decided to commit to having monthly meetings called the Abraham Women's Panel, monthly meetings starting November 7th, December 9th, January. We have it on the calendar until this war is done. And then on the positive side, after the war is done, because it will end, that we want to be very proactive in making sure that we say we're multi-faith, but really extend the olive branch to our Jewish colleagues and look for more ways to partner together. So we're looking, so I'll keep it short, but we just plan on continuing to go forward with the Abraham Women's Alliance.
Great. Heidi, so you're one of those Jewish women, and I'm just wondering, I know so many Jews are devastated because it feels like people who they felt a kinship to in the past, they feel abandoned. And I'm just wondering if that's how you felt as well.
Yeah, so it could be an hour-long conversation, right? Just in and of itself. I think what was most astonishing and hurtful was I didn't really understand how deep the disinformation, the anti-Zionism, the assuming the worst because it's Israel and Jews. I honestly just really didn't understand that in my own circles of women's rights activists. And because now with social media, I can see everything that everyone thinks about or thinks that they need to share all the time. It's overwhelming. It was very overwhelming. And I felt a sense of paralysis for about 6 weeks until I reconnected with Shireen on an event we had celebrating women, life, and freedom on November 28th. So yes, alienated, shocked, and then suddenly like, does anyone actually like me? Is everyone going to hate me now? I really, it's just hard to know. So yes, it's been a shocking, overwhelming time. And I feel like I found my footing since Shireen told me that Jewish women are becoming part of this alliance. And I feel safe and loved and that I do still share common goals with other women in this world, and we do have values that we're striving to fulfill.
Thank you. Zainab, you actually wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal against anti-Semitism. What motivated you to do this?
Well, after October 7th, with Mala, we keep in mind with Mala, we've done for over 10 years, we were doing events and programs with the interfaith community, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, and after October 7th happened, I reached out to a plethora of our ethnic Muslim partners, whether it be museums or, mosques, whatnot, to issue a statement of support with our Jewish brothers and sisters. And I found myself struggling with this. And it really dawned on me that there's a big issue of speaking out against anti-Semitism within the Muslim American community. And for a very long time, this is kind of always what I've also seen, is that there's always been a caveat when Muslim organizations partner with Jewish organizations. There's also the anti-Zionism part, right? And this really, I think, fueled a lot of that vile, vicious, hateful rhetoric that's been supported on social media, yet at the same time drowns out voices of Muslim Americans that do stand up against extremism, that do stand together with Jewish community members. But why does it have to be so, coerced in cohesion and stand like sending out these vile rhetoric messages of just hate and then continuing that on? So that's what compelled me to write this. And honestly, since that article, I've had hundreds and hundreds of conversations with Muslim Americans, with people of Palestinian heritage, that are saying we need to have a voice at the table, and our voices are being drowned out.
Well,
and hence this also saw there's a big need. I'm sorry to kind of go into this, but there's a large problem when it comes to institutional Muslim organizations. And this is the crossroads of where I'm seeing their change needs to happen with.
Well, this was my question to you, actually. Can you just give us a little picture of how the Muslim American community is organized? I mean, and do the groups that do the institutions, do they actually represent what most people think?
Well, unfortunately, I think a large number of bad actors and players have had a seat at the table for too long. There is very problematic groups like CARE and ISNA and ICNA that are theologically and politically run. They really don't represent mainstream Muslim Americans, and they have a very strong agenda. What I want to kind of bring about is for a lot of Muslim Americans that really don't have a place or a space to, and I'm not the one in the face of all Muslim Americans. That's not what I'm saying here. But when it comes to speaking out against anti-Semitism, it doesn't signal bombing for Gaza. It doesn't signal that you're supporting, Israel's policies, but let's have some moral clarity and stand up against the hate that we're seeing and that's supported on social media and through these rallies and these protests and the way that the Muslim American, community is being represented.
Well, we hear a lot about, suddenly we hear the word Islamist being thrown around a lot. And, I know from having studied Islam that it's a very complex religion and faith and civilization. And, but people are talking about Islamists. What's the difference between Islam and an Islamist? Zainab.
It looks like she's frozen.
Well, I'll come back to that question.
I could try to answer it briefly and then have her add to it. Would you like that or not?
Well, actually, I have another question for you,
Okay.
and then you can come back to that because it's related. But your background, your family, your father is from Iran, and I'm wondering, really, and Iran played such a central role, with the attacks and Hamas and supporting Hamas and really causing instability throughout the Middle East and throughout the world at this point. And I'm just wondering, and I'm always, I'm always fascinated by the difference between the Iranian people and what they think and feel, and what the, Iranian Revolutionary Guard is, the messages of that. And I was just wondering if you could give us a little insight into that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, what I can tell you is Iranians inside Iran and outside desperately want to see regime change. We want to see a vibrant democracy. To highlight that, Reza Pahlavi, the Shah's son, was one of the highest ranking dignitaries to visit Israel in the last year. And he went to the president, extending the olive branch, and said, how can we work together to build a democracy in Iran? How can you extend some gesture, perhaps helping to send water to Iran, because the Iranians have so many issues right now with droughts and so forth. And so, there's this desire to not only have experience freedom, but to reach out to the West or to Israel or to Asia and look for solutions. So what I can tell you is a lot of Iranians are actually really hoping that Israel will overcome in this war, that they will have success, that they'll bring stability to that region, because they don't support the regime, and they don't support how their resources are being squandered on this war and other proxy wars.
Yes.
So it's an interesting time to see that Iranians actually align themselves with Israel more than the Arabs in this conflict.
Thank you. That's fascinating. Zainab, I'm just going to ask you a quick question, which you didn't get to hear, which was, we hear a lot about the word Islamist these days. And I just thought maybe just briefly, if you could just elucidate and share what's the difference between an Islamist and Islam? Because I think they get conflated a lot.
Gosh, we definitely don't have enough time for that. And unfortunately, where I think a lot of the the community really just lies in it's Islamist. It's a political ideology. It's a political, theological, and it's a whole mess. Basically, it does not represent mainstream Muslim Americans. That really Muslim Americans have an incredible contribution to this country. We have incredible leadership, philanthropy, leaders in all different sectors. Mala has actually championed Muslim American Heritage Month for the month of January, spotlighting the unique contributions of Muslims all across this country, ranging from first generation to fourth generation to immigrants. They are not represented by an extremist ideologist, and many of us have actually lived under extremism, very similar to Shirin and her family. My father fled that. My husband fled that, and we don't want this. We know very much what this kind of ideology can really do, and what a devastating effect it has across generations. So yes, I would definitely Google and look that up. There's a bunch of information out there, but mainstream Muslim Americans deserve better representation than what's out there.
Thank you. Heidi, I know we're all very worried about American democracy at this point, which is threatened by fragmentation of identity, which some of it's coming from the far left. And I'm just wondering, how ideology, do you view ideology as pushing us into corners, and what we can do about it? So tell us a little bit about your thoughts.
Yes, I would love to. Excuse me. Well, so first of all, since October 7th, I've seen very much how those of us who perhaps live in the academic world, where things are very clear cut and things have to fit into theories and ideologies, when complicated things happen in the real world, we get stuck in the ideological, theoretical corners that we put ourselves in. And quite often when you put a post-colonial theory or a critical race theory, all these different theories into a real world complex situation, by the way, that isn't in the United States and isn't a United States conflict, it just doesn't add up, and you can't even have a conversation, because if it doesn't fit the parameters of the conversation, then it must be bad, or it's just beyond conversation. Mm-hmm. So I see that happening with people in my circles, where they just can't have an honest conversation about the real life people who are suffering from this war. The other thing I think very much is that in America, we're not used to talking about difficult things, right? We're not supposed to talk about politics and religion, especially not at the dinner table or the Thanksgiving table. And all of a sudden, there's something that is in all of our living rooms, for whatever reason, the obsession with Israel, that we don't like to disagree with each other. We don't know how to do that civilly. We don't know, if we don't disagree, that we then can't talk to each other anymore. So all of a sudden, we're being asked to do something that culturally is very uncomfortable for us as Americans. And it makes it even worse, right? So dialogues don't happen at all. People are unfollowing each other. They're no longer friends. They can't be in the same room together. And we're all suddenly thinking the worst of each other. So the conflict that is so based in dehumanization of the other is definitely spreading here. And we are completely dehumanizing each other and forgetting that, vulnerability, curiosity, a beginner's mind, all of these qualities of when you just really don't know what all is going on, and taking the time to converse with others and see really where they're coming from. I don't think we have these skills in this country unless you've spent a lot of time training yourself to do this. So I think this all really exacerbates this very explosive situation as well.
Mm-hmm.
Which brings me to Shireen. We're all women here, and this is a conversation that's, very important to be held by women. And I'm thinking about, why is that so? Why is it so important to bring women together and to train women to be leaders, and to train women to lead conversations?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes. Well, the research actually backs it up. There's been a lot of research. I'm sure Heidi and Zainab have seen it on women, peace, and security. And one of the things we've learned is that women oftentimes detect danger very early. And I remember being with a group of women in Marrakesh, and there was a prominent Jewish leader named Yael who leads a group called Women Wage Peace. And she was very anxious in June. She's like, Shireen, you have to come to Israel. We're doing a peace march in October. It was literally a day or two before the attacks. It's like it was almost prophetic. Like she knew in her spirit something was coming. I can't explain that. So they detect danger early. They're also oftentimes the ones that go to the front lines first responders. And then lastly, women tend to know how to pressure men to come together to the peace table, to, mothers, daughters, wives will tell their husbands and men, we have to work this out. Another piece of research that if you want to stop a suicide bomber, the best person to stop him is his mother. So, it goes on and on. We have these skills and we need to put them to work. And then finally, we need to demand, and I'll repeat it, demand that we have a seat at the table, whether it's the Abraham Accords or at the White House, where women, indigenous women who've worked and lived in the region, can actually consult and give advice on peace building strategies. So yes, it's time. It's time.
Zainab, do you have, outreach to women in the Muslim community? I mean, what happens there? Is there a difference between your outreach to men and women and how they respond?
No, I echo what Shireen just stated. I think women really have to have a seat at the table, be in these high level discussions, decision making, policy. This is extremely important. I can say historically, I mean, even now, of what I've seen in who actually has a seat at the table, the White House denounced, care from being present in what they were able, he basically said, their executive director. This is something that I think women really are the peace builders, are the ones that are able to have these very difficult conversations. Our leadership skills really are needed to bring about change. And Heidi, I know you've done incredible work with not just women leaders domestically, but internationally. We have to keep providing platforms for this kind of change, for this kind of dialogue.
Well, let's talk about how we have these conversations. And all of it, and I love to hear from all of you, really. We can start with Shireen. I know we talked about, how do you have a conversation with people who don't agree with you? And maybe you can give us an example from your own family or two.
Yes. Well, one of the things I've learned even from my husband is that you have to establish some ground rules. You have to discuss your expectations up front, and you need to be honest, it could be a very taboo or uncomfortable subject. As Heidi said, a lot of Americans steer clear of religion and politics. And yet, being Iranian, I love talking about religion and politics. So, we need to acknowledge where people are at, but also encourage them to move to the middle instead of just staying in our courts, and becoming very tribal, just almost like a marriage, right? When you're having problem with your spouse, like move to the middle. How can we move to the middle? And remember that we're human beings at the end of the day. And as women, we just have this affinity. I don't know if it's because we can create life, or we're grandmothers or aunts or sisters. We have that capacity. We have to remind ourselves of that and come together, just keep coming together.
Well, you actually had mentioned to me that you had some conversations with some family members, and I thought you could tell us a little bit about those.
Well, I am the oldest sister of two very talented, powerful brothers, and they're completely different on the spectrum as far as politics and religion and all that. And I oftentimes find myself in a tug of war, and I adore my brothers, but instead of ending the conversation in tears, I'm learning to negotiate peace and to realize, I don't need to have the final statement. I don't need to make those but comments, to listen, but also to have a sense of identity. Like, it's okay if we disagree, and we don't know how this is going to play out. And everything's changing every day, but I want to be on the side of life and peace. And I tell them that I will always prefer to be on the side of peace and moving forward and encouraging the peace process. So I think it's having a clear sense of identity, having some ground rules with your family members. And then, with my brothers or whoever, friends, neighbors, colleagues, it's inevitable there will be conflict, and not to take it personally. But, know who you are, know what your values are, and stick to them.
And women always know how to find, or many women and some men also have this trait, looking for the consensus. I always think of it as the RBG Scalia example, which are two people who have very different political and legal ideas, but yet manage to come together over something else, because in the long term, you build trust. Zainab, what's been your experience in having conversations since October 7th? And what kind of advice do you suggest, really? What is your...
There's a lot. I think going back into the women's angle of this, when Sheryl Sandberg spoke and made the video about the issue of rape being used as a tool in war, that this is not a political issue. This is not a partisan issue, that all of us together can come and say, this is horrific. When you look at the comments on her video, it's like, we're really not able to come together on this. And why? Why did it take so long for so many women's organizations to say, you know what, this is horrific? And women, I know Muslim American women are just, they're powerhouses. They've led the fight in discrimination, in honor violence, in rape being used in war. We've archived so many stories of women that have stood up against extremism, that have brought about change in our community. Why could we not do this after October 7th? And I think this really makes me wonder, like, how are we defining allyship? How are we defining our activism, our engagement, and standing up against something that is just so universally horrific and atrocious?
Heidi.
And these are very difficult conversations. These are very, very difficult conversations. They're not just one time around, they're ongoing. But I think what this does is it really encourages people to look at things from a different lens and say, you know what, this is wrong. This is what we have to stand up against. And this is what Hamas did. We can never allow this to happen again.
Thank you. Heidi, what kind of advice do you have for having conversations with people who don't agree with you?
Well, so I want to answer it this way, that conversations in the post 10/7 world have been fascinating, to say the least. And in order to, go at it again the next day, I have to do a little, put on like a lab coat and take a step back and make sure I'm not taking things personally. And what I found, and I know this, not everyone may agree, or this has been my experience, that the conversations are very different based on the generation to whom I'm speaking. So if it's an older generation, it's very easy. I feel there's a common frame of reference, understanding of history in the world, and we're genuinely having conversations to understand how do we get to this moment, right? And it's trusting, and it's exploratory and substantive. When I get into younger generations who are primarily getting their news and world opinions and worldviews from social media and clickbait media, quite honestly, it's much more difficult, and the conversations are much more challenging. And I find myself thinking, wait a minute, before we even talk about the issue, like, what are the terms that each of us are using, and what are the definitions of those terms? Because I may be using the same word as you, it does not have the same definition, and therefore we're talking at each other, we can't talk to each other. So it's a lot of deconstructing of conversation in order to have meaningful conversation. And then also I found myself quite often realizing, wait, this person that I'm conversing with, this is not a good faith actor. And if it's not a good faith actor, then they're just on a soapbox and they want to tell me how they think the world should work and what is wrong and who is right and all these things. And this is not someone that I can get somewhere new with. And so I have to conserve my energy, as a leader of an organization, as a Jewish person in the world right now, and as a mother of 3 small children. So I have to be very wise about where I exert the energy. So I would say never before has it been so important to know how to have open dialogue, but to be able to determine who really is on the other side of the conversation, and decide where to go with it based on that individual person. And like Shireen said, it's not always about having the last say or being right, but quite often the conversations that I don't feel are going anywhere, I see them as opportunities to find out, where is my knowledge maybe not so sharp? What do I need to be smarter about, look deeper into? And so therefore I appreciate all the conversations I have, even if I don't feel that they're all in good faith. I think maybe that answers the question. That's what I wanted to say in response to the question.
Well, you brought up a really important point, which was the generational gulf. And I think we are seeing that playing out. And I'm wondering, Zainab, do you have some thoughts about, Shirin? I mean, how do we bridge that gulf? I mean, it's a huge, the gulf of knowledge. It's really a gulf of knowledge, as you've described, I think. Do you have thoughts about that?
I think that inflammatory language, where we have to check ourselves, and when are we using this? How are we using this? Is this impacting? Would I say this publicly? I think social media has become kind of a screen for people, like this fence, and they're not aware that what they post is necessarily going out. This is how people react. This is something that I think really comes from communities. How leadership is addressing it, what kind of a message is being sent of what's acceptable, and putting a line that, that we're crossing hate, we're crossing the line of hate. This is hate speech, this is inflammatory, this is dangerous. And it really has to start with the conversations that we have at the dinner table with our families, with our colleagues. This is where it begins.
I guess, which brings us back to the fact that, social media can be very dangerous, and media itself is very complicated here. But what the 3 of you have been doing, and other women have been coming together in person or in Zoom and having one-on-one conversations. And that's worked for you. And how can we create how can we reach more people? Yes, Shirin.
Yeah, so it does go back to knowledge and education. I do think we need to have a comprehensive strategy, all of us in our own way, of educating the next generation. I'm big on freedom of speech, but I do think there's a limit. Just like you can't go into a theater and yell fire, right? There's a limit. And I also think you cannot call for the death of any particular group, even a person. And so I think we do need to look at free speech. Again, I think the issues are more complicated and nuanced today than perhaps when, our forefathers, or even 60 years ago, 30 years ago. It's just, we become such a melting pot, and there are so many bad actors that are using free speech for their purposes. So we need to explore it. And then secondly, education. One of the questions we ask is, why has Iran not seen a tipping point yet in overcoming the Islamic regime and becoming a democracy? And our research showed that, they want democracy, but it's usually in the bigger cities like Tehran and Isfahan, the educated, the economically empowered. But to really see a shift, we've got to reach the people in the farthest corners. And thankfully, through the internet and through online courses and social media, we can. So we have to continue to educate the public about these issues and teach them about the benefits of a multi-faith democratic society with women's rights and, caring for minorities. So lots of work to be done, but it's an exciting time. And this issue shows that we have to keep persevering and keep leaning in.
Thank you. Do we have any questions from Suzanne?
Yep. Yes. Thank you all very
Thank
much.
you so much. This is just, there's so much more to talk about, but I know we're running out of time.
Yeah. So quickly, somebody wanted to know, how can we make, why with, so many women's organizations and women speaking up, within recent years, the Me Too movement, other movements, and we have seen silence when people addressing the horrible sexual crimes that were against women on October 7th. And so why do you think so many people, organizations, the UN, it took so long to speak up? And what do you think the impact of that's going to be long-term as well?
May I take that?
Please.
Okay, I have two answers. One is I don't have the full answer. October 7th and the silence has thrown me into a deep dive into the why and the how. From what I've started to understand in research, I'm going back to 1975 when at the UN, Zionism was equated to racism, and that this was actually a Soviet propaganda tool to do their thing. At that moment in time, that Zionism equals racism ideology also entered into the feminist movement. And so that then coincided with the wave of feminism that gave more space for women of color to have a voice. And so again, there was this conflation of a conflict and a situation happening in another region of the world being plastered onto an American context. So we're in a great big ideological mess. And as I said earlier, this idea that we have to stick to our theories and ideologies, that when we put them in the real world, they don't match up. So we're stuck in that quagmire. So I'm looking into that personally, and I would recommend to whoever asked the question to do that. And then the silence, I do think it's because of the zero-sum game of this conflict. I do see that, especially for Palestinian women that I am in touch with and talk to, that to acknowledge that that happened is at the expense of the Palestinian of self-determination for Palestinians. And I obviously don't agree with that, but I'm also exploring that where it's the either or. And I do think it has very grave consequences when as Shirin or Zainab, I'm not sure who said, but when women's rights are politicized in this way, and that something as old and awful as rape as a weapon of war can only be prosecuted for some women and not all women. And yes, that's why I wanted to find women to talk to, because this is a very huge inflection point in our global efforts for human rights, and it's really working to undermine. And I just want to say one more thing, is that the executive director of UN Women, Sima Bahous, is the former representative of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan to the UN. Queen Rania is Palestinian, and Sima Bahous's messaging through UN Women and Queen Rania's messaging have been exactly the same. So I'm very upset that I feel that the executive director of UN Women is very much carrying out Jordanian foreign policy and not representing all women in the world. And that deeply undermines, obviously, all the work that UN Women and the United Nations has sought to achieve for eliminating discrimination against women and promoting women's rights as human rights. Thank you for letting me answer that.
It's also, it's also really important to point out that the countries that, Iran and Russia, these are all countries that are run by Hamas. These are all countries that there's no women involved in any of these, running any of these countries. And so, it's just not the previous ideology from history, which I think is really fascinating that you brought up, Heidi. But it's like, there's deliberate reason when women are, these are societies, politics, cultures where women are not wanted in politics and making decisions. So that's a really important point. Shireen.
Yes, I like to kind of continue what Heidi said. One of the things I've noticed, and I'm not, unique to this, but it's the bundling of different groups. And that, if you're pro climate and you're pro LGBT and you're pro BLM and then of course you must be pro, Hamas or pro Palestine, and you cannot even consider the Jewish perspective or what is anti-Semitism. And I've seen that in conversations, and I'll say it to a family person, what you're saying is anti-Semitism, and they look at me like, no, and I'm like, it is, like, you need to confront it. So that's my concern. And, as a women's group, I found it personally very offensive. I don't know how you feel, Heidi, but, I read a lot of these UN declarations and so forth, and they always bundle women's rights with all the other rights. I mean, and not to disparage any other group, but we're in there with the disabled and all these different women are women. We're over 50% of the population, and we need to stand up together when we are harmed and hurt. So I think we need to stand back and realize that there's a lot of confusion, and we cannot bundle all these things and put people in different camps. We have to have the ability to be bipartisan and to look at each issue individually. And I don't think young people have figured that out. It's like, well, I'm over here, so don't ask me to be sympathetic to this group over here that may not be part of my bundling. So
yeah,
just
and that goes into the social conditioning, and the virtue signaling, and then also, it's not Islamophobic to stand up against extremism. I think for the Muslim American community, we've been so drilled and honed in that if you speak out, then you're essentially falling into the trap of Islamophobic narrative. And I think after October 7th, we can really see that we have to take a stand against that. And it does not represent us. But what are we doing to counter that narrative? And I think it's a wake-up call for many, many communities, many marginalized minority communities, and women, essentially, like, how are we addressing women's issues? How are we addressing rape that's used during war? How are we addressing this extremist ideology and dehumanizing Jewish communities and Jewish or anybody who's connected, or has a sense of identity with Israel? How are we doing that? And what kind of language are we using that's inflaming that rhetoric?
Yeah. Can I add just one more thing? This was such a meaty question, right? So I just want to say, to go to what Shireen was saying, I see this as the unintended negative consequences of an intersectional approach to human rights issues. And I always call upon, whenever I see this, I always call upon Iranian women's rights activists leading up to the revolution that led to the ascent of the Islamic regime, which is that women were not women in Iran, groups who knew that women's rights had something to lose if Khomeini came to power, ignored that in the name of coming together to remove the Shah, right? We don't like what we have. This person is saying, come along with me. And once I'm in power, you'll have what you want and I'll have what I want. And so they gave up their voice and joined a cause that absolutely used them to come to power. And I see the same thing in the women's rights movement. So I agree, like we have specific issues, we have specific experiences, and it's very important to keep that separate. It doesn't mean we don't have intersections and commonalities, but there is still a uniqueness to every struggle, and there has to be a way to promote our individual struggles that then will benefit all. And I know that's not the most popular thing to say, but we got to say it. We got to speak truthful, just like Zainab is speaking truthfully about anti-Semitism in her community, and amplifying the voices that are calling her and saying, no, this does not represent me. I mean, I'm so grateful to you for doing the work that you do. It's so brave and powerful. And it is so important to not just go along with the herd for all of us, right? In all of our separate organizations and the conversations that are happening in our communities.
And just to kind of go into one of the questions, I know there's several of them where are the Palestinian voices on this? There's been many that I know, Mala, we're planning on a series of events amplifying the voices of Palestinian Americans that really have felt like their identity has been hijacked with these far left, these protests, this hateful rhetoric. Anti-Semitism is not part of their cause. It actually hinders them, and it disempowers them from the liberation and the autonomy that they want in their identity. And so there are many voices. They've been drowned out. Having conversations like this includes them on the table. I know Shireen has done an incredible job in spotlighting Palestinian American women that have been trying to placed unique identity and representation, and their struggle represented. And this is just, I think, a start of this, but this is where we begin. This is how we begin in bringing these voices to the table.
Thank you. Another question is, how do you encourage or advice for people who want to speak up and speak out, but they are afraid? They either feel like they will be targeted, or they don't have the exact right thing to say. What kind of training and advice do you give those people?
Well, I'm big on education. There are a lot of resources. Empower Women Media has a course called Live What You Believe that actually teaches people how to, stand in their commitment to their faith community, and to be able to acknowledge that that's good for peace and security. It's good for women's rights. It's good for building strong business economies when you are able to stand up and represent yourself in your community, but also understand the other point of view. So I think education, keep reading, learn how others communicate. Heidi, Zainab, and I, we've been on this stage for years, so it just kind of flows for us. But it's a process. It's years and years of research and reading and engaging and listening. So I would say anyone who's afraid, take some time to think, to read, to process, journal, get to that place where you feel like you have something to share. Maybe it's just a little soundbite or a post, but it does require some effort. It really does.
Anybody else have any advice?
I would just want to ask more questions of that person. Is it on social media? Is it within family? Is it within a faith community? Where is the fear to have those? And then my answer would be more specific to the arena. But everything Shireen just said is incredibly good advice, and that's definitely the place to start, is education and knowledge. And I think also knowing, again, I have to know who's the person asking, but we don't have to have something to say about everything. We really don't have to be experts on everything. We can just observe, listen, and send good thoughts and love and energy out into the world, just in our interactions with human beings on a day-to-day basis.
Mm-hmm. We've also had some questions. If you would like to comment on what's going on college campuses, on the statements by the college presidents, and going back to the topic of young people who have not necessarily had experience with coming to a table and dialoguing, and thinking that just being on a campus and protesting is the way to go, without talking to others. Any thoughts on that?
Well, actually, Shireen, you had mentioned that you had a conversation with another family member. And do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, so
Yes.
actually, we had conversations with young women in our network that are students and are in the media fellowship. And I was discouraged to hear that she was so critical of Israel in general, and it, kind of being very polarizing. It's all about dialogue, just engaging with her, asking questions. I think on the college campus, kids are, excited. They want to be involved. They want to be active. They want to, raise their voice. But it's important to take time with young people and really help them process, like, does this really represent? Have you looked at both sides? And get people talking, as Heidi said, ask good questions, engage young people, but also caution them. I told my daughters, who are, I reminded them, we are Iranian American and Iran is funding Hamas, and I better not see you at those protests. And of course, I'm being a mom, but I needed to share my perspective as a parent that, you need to know who you are, what is your identity, and you don't want to be on the side of this community, Hamas, it's being funded by Iran, that's taken away our country and we can't even go back and visit. So you need to have those honest conversations, share your story. I think when you share your own story with young people, they're more apt to listen and engage.
I think we talked earlier about how many young people don't really understand what they're getting into when they go to a demonstration or a protest, or they're even, reading things on social media or participating. They don't realize the connections between Iran and Hamas, or they just don't know that. How do we teach that?
Well, I think they're also dissociated in sense of like what their actual actions are and what social media kind of gives like a protective covering in, and then what actually translates, how this translates into real life and what kind of hate this is turning into. And that the fact that, Jewish students are being mobbed, that a Jewish man was killed at one of these protests. Let's not forget that there was a young Palestinian boy that was stabbed to death by a deranged, hateful neighbor. I mean, this is all what it translates into. And defacing property, in Washington, D.C., shutting light and putting a projection of, martyrdom on a federal building. Like, this is wrong. This is not sexy. This is not advocating for any social positive change. And it's a Marxist type of a mentality that's being fled into. And then I think there's a big dissociation. They don't understand history. They're going by hashtags. They're going by an image and what they're able to post on Instagram, but they're not really connecting it to what the consequences are in real life in this. And there's a huge disconnect there.
I would ask though, how do you balance some of that when a lot of people they see as authority are their professors, and there are a lot of professors who are kind of egging them on?
Well, what happened to not trusting authority? Why are professors suddenly Lord High Ruler of everything that we think? Like, aren't we supposed to push against authority once in a while to really understand the world in a better place? Like, why is what your professor says the thing? I mean, we always have to be pushing back. Children are always pushing back against parents. That's how we grow, right? The seed in the dirt pushes up and down and then comes through the ground to blossom. So if we're not having dialogue and disagreement in the places where that's exactly what we're there to learn how to do, not to just become automatons that spit out information, like obviously we're failing in our education system. And I just wanted to add that what that question brought up for me is what I'm really sad about seeing all these young people coming out and protesting is they're protesting, it's like they're fighting for destruction. They're not channeling all that beautiful youth energy and idealism into building something new. So I fear that all these people are coming out into the streets, just like they did in the Arab uprisings, right? Social media created a critical mass. You got on the street, you toppled statues, you ousted dictators, but you had no plan for the day after. So why aren't our youth thinking about what comes next? What are we building toward? We know what we don't want. It's so easy to tear something down. My 4-year-old destroys my living room in 2 minutes. Takes me a half hour to put it back together. So put that on the college campus. Can't we put our energy of our youth into thinking, okay, how do we make the world a better place? Not just how do we tear down what is? I'm tired of this, honestly. And the parents are paying way too much money in tuition to be funding that sort of destructive behavior.
And with leadership, we're normalizing hate. We're normalizing abnormal behavior.
Yes.
This is the bigger picture of it.
Yeah.
Yes, and I agree. And I think it's really easy to lift your voice. It's a whole different thing to get your hands dirty and get involved. I'll share another example. A few years ago, I remember all these young people storming towards the airport. It was something about immigration laws, and they were all, and I can understand why they wanted to support immigrants to be able to come to the U.S. But I thought those thousands of young people, if they would actually volunteer at food shelters, be tutoring their Palestinian Arab refugees, if they were babysitting and helping and serving, and there's so many other ways to make a difference. And it breaks my heart. I attend a local church here. They haven't mentioned Israel once, and I'm devastated. They haven't said, let's pray for Israel. And so many resources, and I love my church. They do a lot of great things, but I'm like, they could be doing so much more for the immigrant population, and many of those who are becoming radicalized in our own country. right? Because people are not reaching out. They're not loving them. They're not bringing a meal. They're not helping to babysit or give, carpooling. There's so many practical ways we could be serving each other rather than just showing up in the streets. And we need to get back to that. What makes America great is the way we serve one another. Our family suffered greatly after the Iranian Revolution. We lost everything. We left the country with suitcases and came to a house with no furniture. My mom just had to throw things together. She died a year later from extreme stress, and we had nothing. I was 14 years old, brother 11 and 12. We had American neighbors in the midst of a hostage crisis that loved us, fed us, drove us to school, took me to basketball practice. I would be a different person today if that American family and others did not reach out to us, love us, and literally raise us. And so I guess what I'm saying is there's so much more we can do to protest to change the world. And it really gets back to serving and loving each other and being Americans. That's what makes us great.
Thank you. So I think on that we have to wrap up. So I think that's a good place to end. There's a lot more work that needs to be done, a lot more conversations to be had, and we will try and convene everybody back for another session in the coming months. I want to thank you, Heidi and Shirin and Zainab and Nadine, for this excellent conversation. I want to thank WNET for helping to put this together and co-sponsoring today's program. I will be sending out a follow-up email that will include a link to today's program, and we ask that you share it with others. That's kind of the first step is for people to see these conversations. I will also include in that email all the links that I put in the chat, which are to the links to everybody's organizations and the op-ed articles. And please go to momentmag.com where you can find out about more of our programming in the coming weeks. Again, thank you everybody for joining us, and we will see you next time.
Thank you. It was great talking to you.
Thank you, Nadine.
Thank you, ladies.
Thank you so much.